Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Maya Angelou and Still I Rise. Maya Angelou and Still I Rise is the first feature documentary about the life and legacy of Maya Angelou. Having begun her creative career as a singer and dancer, Angelou later rose to a higher prominence as a poet and writer. Her illustrious career as a memoirist began with the classic I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The Peabody Award-winning documentary serves as a visual accompaniment to her collection of memoirs by telling the story of Angelou's life with her voice and through photographs and clips. I decided to review this documentary about Maya Angelou for Women's History Month. The reason is that in telling her story, number one, she's a prominent figure, a writer who, while sharing her own experience, gives voice to the experience of a lot of other Black people, and in particular, Black women. And in previously writing a brief profile of her life, I knew that she'd been involved with quite a number of prominent figures from Black history, the arts, and various aspects of the civil rights movement. I knew from writing this profile of her life that she'd worked in a variety of jobs in her youth, later as a performing artist, and she would rise to true prominence and fame as a writer. So I had some knowledge of what to expect when they would be discussing her life. But this documentary gives you her life story told through interviews, as well as clips of her appearances on various TV shows, events, speaking engagements, etc. It's one thing to read a biography, or in her case, read her autobiography. That can be moving in and of itself. But it takes things to another level to hear someone tell you about their life and how they were feeling in the moment, experiencing things in their own words and in their own voice. To hear a person tell you about their life, tell you about a particular moment, it's different, right? To hear it in their voice, to hear the emotion in their voice, it adds another layer. And that's certainly the case here, where we have Maya Angelou in her own words, along with interviews of people who knew her telling her life story. And it's actually pretty cool because it goes back over her life in chronological fashion, telling the story of her parents, of her birth, her early life, her being born in St. Louis, her parents moving to LA, then having this contentious relationship and ultimately deciding that with the marriage falling apart, neither one of them wanted the responsibility of raising Angelou or her older brother. Thus, at the age of 3 and 4, they were put in a train and sent to their grandmother in Arkansas. I remember reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This was many years ago. And more recently, reading various articles to get some background to write the profile about her. But somehow, these little kinds of details slip away. I knew that her and her brother were quite young, but it wasn't until watching the documentary that I realized just how young they were when their parents sent them on this cross-country train ride to their grandmother. I remember traveling to the Virgin Islands by myself as a kid to visit family, and it was a positive experience as I was a few years older, the flight staff was nice, and I knew when I would return home. The circumstances of my travel was different from theirs in that my mom was sending me to visit my great uncle for just part of the summer, and so I knew it was just a vacation. But in their case, it was a more traumatic experience because, number one, they were younger, and this was a train ride where they were leaving from LA and going to Arkansas, having to change trains and rely on the kindness of the train porters and other staff for an extended amount of time. They were sent by their parents to live with their grandmother, and not for a definite amount of time. It was just pretty much their parents packing them up and sending them to live with this relative because they couldn't really deal with kids at that point in their relationship or at that point in their lives. She touches on the trauma of that experience of being very young, not having been away from their parents prior to this point, or at least not for any extended amount of time. And here it is that their parents put them on a train and sent them across the country to stay with their grandmother for who knows how long. Maya Angelou speaks on the trauma of that event. It certainly impacted her and her brother at that time. And she mentions that despite him being just 4 at the time, that he never really recovered from that experience. And she likely never did either. Their grandmother wound up being a source of comfort for them. But in those initial moments, it was a great loss. It was traumatic to have their mom and dad send them away. And the way that Maya Angelou coped with it was pretty much to mentally kill off her mom, to basically forget about her mom as a way of dealing with her not being there. Had they remained and grown up in, let's say, St. Louis or LA with their parents, it would have been different from the experience that they had growing up in Stamps, Arkansas, where Stamps is described as being a very small town. It's in the South versus being out west or in the Midwest, where certainly You would have had racism in those other environments as well, but most likely not this openly hostile racism that they would encounter in Stamps. As this was during the time of segregation, there was a black school and a white school, and it was significant that her grandmother, who was actually the grandchild of slaves, was, if not the only black person, then the only black woman in the area to independently own a store. And you think about the independence and what that means at that time, probably without even being conscious of it. The example that it likely set for Angela and her brother, their grandmother's independence, and the example of pride and dignity that you would learn from growing up around such a woman. I found it especially poignant that Maya Angelou was fairly certain that her grandmother started teaching her to read on the very day that she arrived. Consider that reading and writing would go on to play such a large role in her life. At this very pivotal moment in her life, this thing of being sent to live with her grandmother, you also have this other pivotal thing happening, which is her learning to read and write from her grandmother. So take that into consideration, right? With the other things that she would learn from her grandmother, the other experiences that she would have in being with her grandmother, the role that this woman would play, the example that she would set in Angelou's life. As the documentary goes on, I began to notice, and I'll touch on this on my later review of the Toni Morrison documentary, where they both had these memorable experiences that sparked their interest in reading and writing. In the case of Maya Angelou, she had a few of those experiences. The first of which is that on the day that she arrived at her grandmother's home, having been sent away from her parents, her grandmother began teaching her to read. And the second experience was a few years later, unfortunately being raped by her mother's boyfriend. I believe she was 7 years old. So she told her brother what happened. He, in turn, told an adult. The man was arrested, but was then released from jail, at which point he was murdered shortly thereafter in retaliation for the rape. Using child logic, Angelou felt her words had caused his death. And through this, she realized the power of words, that her words, whether rightly or wrongly, had the power to result in the death of this man. And with that, she made the decision to not speak. At the time, Angelou had either been visiting or living with her mother in St. Louis. And it sounds like they became frustrated at not knowing what to do with her once she stopped speaking, so they sent her back to her grandmother. Number one, her grandmother welcomed her with open arms and didn't pressure her to speak. Not to mention, she continued further building upon that confidence that her brother, her grandmother, her uncle had started within her at an early age, telling her that she was smart and intelligent. Her grandmother's brother actually had been teaching her math, her multiplication tables. So in her grandmother's home and in the presence of her brother and her great uncle, her intelligence was encouraged. Them pouring all of this effort and energy into teaching her, into instilling confidence in her by praising her intellect, and being taken into this environment where this traumatic thing had happened to her, right? Rape is about power. The experience is meant to demean, right? It's meant to dispower, and it took away her voice. But upon returning to her grandmother's home, her grandmother consoled her, telling Angelou that there was no rush for her to speak, as she would speak in her own time, and that when she began speaking again, her voice would return with a vengeance. She would reach a point in life where she wouldn't just speak, but she would speak in her voice, and not just speak in her voice, but speak for the voiceless, right? Become a teacher as well. So you're going to speak for yourself, but you're going to give voice to other people as well. So not having a voice at this particular moment in time is nothing to be concerned about, because when your voice returns and you find not just your physical voice, but your voice as a person is going to more than make up for that lost time. As an adult, I found that incredibly empowering, but it's an unimaginably inspiring thing to tell the child, especially a child who's been through such a traumatic experience. Young Maya Angelou might not have had the vision to see it for herself at that time, but her grandmother certainly did and spoke that future into existence. At the time, Angelou regarded this as her grandma not knowing any better, right? Her grandmother wasn't illiterate, and even in being illiterate, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're lacking in intellect or that you aren't smart. Ignorance is not the same thing as stupidity. It's like the saying that common sense isn't that common, and you can have book sense but no common sense, which isn't a good thing. Miss Flowers, the woman who would introduce her to poetry, served as further inspiration. The way that she gradually encouraged Angelou to speak without pushing her was cool. She cleverly introduced her to poetry and then encouraged her to fully experience poetry by reciting it out loud. And with that, helped her to find her voice and speak again. I'd heard about this experience, but now I'd heard it in different forms, right? It's something different to hear it in her words, to see clips of her speaking about this entire experience. From there, the documentary went on to speak about her life and her having her son at a young age, these other experiences that she would have, working various jobs, getting into the performing arts through dancing, singing. Looking back to those early moments in her life, that experience with her grandmother back in Stamps, Arkansas, the importance of that environment becomes clear. She had this reawakening, this foundation, this confidence that's built within her in this environment that was meant to break her down. This system of segregation where she was treated as a second-class citizen. She speaks about being a young child and having to walk through the white side of town, getting like these looks of disgust, not really wanting to go through that experience, but ultimately finding the best way to deal with this thing was to confront it head on, to raise her head and walk with her head held high with pride and dignity, even in places where she was unwelcomed. Some people are unfortunate in life in that they go through experiences, but they're not given the skills that they need to cope with life, to endure the hardships that they face. And here it is that you have this individual who went through so much at a young age and yet went on to accomplish so much in life. And the reason that she was able to overcome these early negative and traumatizing experiences is because she was surrounded by love and encouragement. Maya Angelou had people in her life provided her with the tools to cope with life, to endure the hardships that she faced. I'm not a religious person, but think of the phrase from the Bible, right? That no weapon formed against me shall prosper. No negativity, no efforts made to stand in my way or to be obstacles in my way to succeed. Some of these things that people experience can break them, but instead, growing up in this environment of loving encouragement, this village that raised this child, they formed the tools to ensure that none of those negative things intended to harm her would succeed. So indeed, no weapon formed against her prospered, but instead, in her youth as a child, she was given the weapons needed to defend herself against these negative experiences and went on to be prosperous in life. I won't go into her teenage years or her experiences in various productions, trying to build a career as a dancer, actress, and singer, though I did chuckle a little bit at it being stated that she sang, but her and others stated that she didn't have the greatest voice. It seems like she was more talented at getting across emotions in music. This discussion of the various productions that she was in, but also the hardship of having her son and by virtue of being in these traveling shows, having to be away from him for extended amounts of time, the guilt that she felt at having to leave her son behind. And in the midst of that, Angelou had various relationships over the course of her life, multiple marriages and romances. She was a grown woman several times over by the time I was born. So not just grown, but grown. Probably a senior citizen by the time I was born. And as a young person, you sometimes look at these older people, right, who were already grown when you were a child, and it's hard to imagine them as young people. But here, hearing her story in her words, it puts her in a different perspective. I like these type of stories where it shows that people aren't saints. They've lived, they've made mistakes, things haven't always gone according to plan, but in the totality of their lives, things kind of worked out as they're supposed to. They might not work out as we plan, but things happen in their own time. Maybe not as we want them to, but as they need to. Through the experiences that she'd had, it allowed her to then go on and have interactions to actually work quite closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and also Malcolm X, to have a very strong friendship with James Baldwin and with a lot of other figures that would loom large in Black history and Black culture. At one point, Angelou was living in Ghana and met Malcolm X. This was around the time that he'd gone on Hajj and was now visiting Africa. And they had some extensive conversations. He was planning to come back to America to start this new organization. And in sharing this vision with her, she decided, after having spent quite a bit of time there in Ghana, to return to America. They began to make all of these grand plans for the future, but he ended up being assassinated. I didn't realize how traumatized she was by his death. And then just a few years later, when trying to recover from the murder of Malcolm X, as she'd lost this friend, this person that she'd respected and cared for, a person that she'd made these grand plans and visions with, where he didn't just die, but died violently. And by the time as you're probably getting to a point of feeling some stillness or making peace as best as you can with that loss, you then experience the death of Dr. King just a few years later. And it basically plunged her into depression. I thought that was really poignant. I'd read about it, but it wasn't put in those terms exactly. And again, the importance of hearing people's experiences in their own words. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was someone that worked in publishing, as well as James Baldwin, who ultimately encouraged her to start writing her life story. So after the death of these two friends, she'd been locked up in her house, depressed and in mourning, grieving the loss of these two friends. James Baldwin showed up at her apartment and pretty much demanded that she let him in. He gave her a stern talking to and then dragged her out of the house to what sounds like a party or a small gathering of some sort. And over the course of the evening, he pushed and encouraged her to share her experiences, to tell everyone about her grandmother and her time growing up in Stamps, Arkansas. And so through that's what sparked this idea that she should start writing her life story. Up to this point, she'd written poetry, plays, things like that, where her focus hadn't been on this type of content before, but out of that trauma, James Baldwin opened up a pathway for this to be a way for her to heal, a way for her to cope with these losses. I'd read about him playing a role in her beginning the writing of this series of books, but you get more details about how exactly it came about. So he told her off a bit and then had her reach back into her past and share these stories at this dinner party about her childhood, about Stamps, about her grandmother. And, once again, having experienced this trauma, even at this point where it sounds like her grandmother probably had already passed away, her experiences with her grandmother, things that she'd learned from her grandmother, were still providing her with the foundation, with the strength and encouragement that she needed to endure, to cope with traumatic experiences. And I just found that incredible. It's the theme throughout the book of her grandmother, of Stamps, Arkansas, seemingly the last place you would think a young Black woman would find encouragement. That's the very place that gives her everything that she needs to persevere in life. Not to glorify struggling or having a hard life, but think of the idea of steel sharpening steel, or when forging steel, you put it into fire, you pound on it to shape it. And it's like putting it into fire. By putting it into the flame, you strengthen the steel. By pounding on it, you shape it to make it useful. And that's not like to say go out of your way to make life difficult for yourself. But the challenges, the things we go through in life, not only help to shape us as a person, but with the right tools, with the right coping mechanisms, when we go through challenges in life, I think we can come out stronger on the other end. That's not to say go out and make life difficult for yourself, but that when faced with difficult tools to deal with them, to endure, persevere, get through them, we end up coming out on the other end the better for it. It strengthens our character. If nothing else, that's what I took away from the documentary. Aside from that, this is just an incredible documentary to check out from the perspective of learning about Maya Angelou's life. But there are these deeper themes as well that are incredibly insightful and inspiring. I highly recommend Still I Rise. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.